Hello, everybody. We've got a full house. We've got a Brian Bowden. We have a Mark Eddy. We have a Chris, and we have a Craig, and we also have a special guest, another Mark DeWidziak, author. You've seen him, Mark Twain, Columbo, Kojak. He's a prolific author, not to mention amazing TV critic. Like I said, he's done a lot of work in that. It was really fascinating the last time we had him on to talk, but we wanted to have him back on to talk Edgar Allan Poe, and he has his new book out, A Mystery of Mysteries: The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. And this one, through the reading, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't even know. I mean, most people, you're gonna Telltale Heart, you're gonna, The Raven, you're gonna have most people are gonna be able to quote these, but there's a lot of things that included like the young love that never came to fruition. And these things are things that he talks about in the book that through his life, and it's really well done. And it's going to be a lot better hearing it from him instead of me rambling on about it. So what we're going to do is, before I make it even more of a butchering of it, we are going to get right to the show, and I'm going to bring everybody on. So sit back, enjoy, and we will see you next. Welcome to the Three Beards podcast. My name's Craig, along with Austin and Chris.
Passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century.
Let me out.
I'm afraid that is right.
Justice and honor in Massachusetts colony?
All right. And like I said, there's Chris. There's Brian. What's up? And there's a Mark. There will be two, I promise.
Yes.
So how's everybody doing?
Fine.
Good. Wonderful. Try to dodge.
No,
the
that's
lightning.
Marky Mark. This is going to be Mark and Mark.
Oh, wow.
Try to dodge the lightning. Hopefully, I don't get struck by lightning. If you see me fry, then you know I got struck by lightning.
Just suddenly just goes black.
Yeah, it's raining pretty bad over here.
Yes. All right, Mark, how are you, sir?
Hey, good to be back.
I'm going to put you center square for the block. All right.
Okay. I'll be all in, eh?
All right.
Put Chris by me, where I am and swap me with Chris.
There we go. All right. Anybody else need swapped? Are we good? We're good.
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right. All right. So the mystery of mysteries, the death and life of Edgar Allan Poe. So this one, like I said in the intro, really good. And I just wanted to get to what led you to, writing this book? I mean, what was the one that just kind of kicked off? It's like, you know what? I'm just going to write a book about this.
It wasn't my idea. And it's not because I don't like Edgar Allan Poe. It's Poe is an author I've carried through my entire life. I read Poe even before, when most people read Poe for the first time, which is about the 7th grade. I mean, we all get The Telltale Heart and The Raven somewhere about the 7th grade, and that's wonderful. But I was actually reading Poe before that, and he's always been one of my favorite authors. I don't have any shortage of ego, but I don't have. Not even I have the stones to say I should be the person to write the next biography of Edgar Allan Poe. That actually came from an editor at St. Martin's. We were having a conversation after I'd done the Twilight Zone book for them. We were having a conversation of the what's next conversation. And He didn't like any of my ideas. I was just striking out with everything I was tossing at him, and he was countering like, well, how about this and how about that? And I didn't like any of his ideas. And this went on for a while, and we kind of reached impasse, and we were about to hang up and sort of table the conversation for another day. And just as we were about to get off the phone, he said, "What about Edgar Allan Poe?" And I about dropped the phone. I said, "What about him?" And he said, "Well, it seems like he checks a lot of your boxes."
Wow.
And I thought, sometimes it just takes somebody else to point out the obvious, because my first thought was, he does? And how's that possible? And he said, well, you've written about major horror topics with Dracula and the Night Stalker. You've written about major mystery topics with Columbo. So you've got Poe, who's the father of the modern detective story and the modern horror story. You were a critic most of your career. He was a critic most of his career. You've written about major 19th century American authors like Mark Twain. You've written literary biography. How is this not in your wheelhouse? And that's kind of, but then it became like the idea of what kind of book he was looking for. And I realized very, very quickly, he wanted a book which was going to be, how like every 2 years, it seems, we get one more book that purports to solve the mystery of who Jack the Ripper was definitively. This book's going to do it. This book's finally going to do it. And every 2 years, here another one comes in on the noon stage. Here it comes. Oh boy, another book saying this is going to prove it. Well, this is what he wanted for the death of Poe's death. Poe died under mysterious circumstances, and when I realized that was the kind of book he wanted, my first response was like, well, maybe you ought to go shopping for another lunatic, because I think this one's flying away. It can't be done. It definitively cannot be done, because, and he said, well, like, why not? And I said, okay, well, first off, there was no autopsy. And even if there had been an autopsy, it would have been worthless, because nobody knew how to do autopsies in 1849. The art of the autopsy doesn't really enter the modern age until the Civil War. The Civil War is the defining moment that brings autopsies into some kind of an art form. So even if an autopsy had been performed, it would have been performed by somebody who didn't know what he was doing and probably using the equivalent of butcher's knives. There was no death certificate. There are no reliable witnesses. All of the witnesses to Poe's death not only contradict each other, but they contradict themselves. They leave behind contradictory accounts of how Poe died. Even the attending physician changes the time of death in his accounts, changes Poe's last words in his accounts. And there's no surviving soft tissue that can be subjected to modern forensics. So for all of these reasons, you can't solve this case definitively. So I said, but I'll tell you what I will do. I'm much more interested in how Poe lived. I'm much more interested in the mystery that's behind who Poe was, because we got an idea who we think he is, and we're wrong. Everybody who thinks they know who Poe is wrong. So I said, well, let me write a book that looks at Poe's life through the filter of his death. We'll use the death as a framing, and if I can come up with what I think is a logical, convincing, and compelling theory as to how he died, I will present it. But I won't go so far as to say I can prove it. So he liked that idea. And so we were off to the races at that point. But that is why the subtitle of the book is reversed. It's a mystery of mysteries, and the subtitle is The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. The usual pattern is to call it The Life and Death of Edgar Allan Poe. I reversed it because it seems like every conversation about Poe starts with the mystery of his death. We almost always start there. And most conversations about anybody's life always starts in the logical point. You always kind of start when somebody's born. That's where you start the conversation. And that's where most biographies start. But with Poe, it always seems in reverse. So the book starts with the death. And basically, it's also looking at the fact that I put life second, because Poe not only has a great life, and there's a mystery about his life, he has a great afterlife. Poe has the greatest afterlife of any writer in the history of the planet, period. he escapes. He dies in 1849. In 1849, Poe in his lifetime was not primarily known as a horror writer. He's not primarily known as a poet. He's not primarily known as a mystery writer. He is primarily known as a literary critic.
Mm-hmm.
And he is so well known as a literary critic in his lifetime, his nickname is the Tomahawk Man. That's how tough he was as a critic. But Poe is buried the day after he dies in 1849. Dies October 7th. He's buried October 8th. And he's buried in a small Presbyterian cemetery in Baltimore on a cold, windy, chilly day. A funeral that's attended by almost nobody. And then the following day, he's buried again. This time, in a not a literal way, but in a biography, an obituary appears in a New York newspaper, written by somebody who Poe thought was a friend, but was actually nursing grudges against Poe. And he writes an obituary, which he puts every slander, he paints Poe as a completely immoral man. He does damage to Poe's reputation that has not been undone to this day. It was a pack of lies, basically. So Poe is buried yet again, this time under this mountain of lies and misinformation. And then in 1875, we buried him again because they dug him up in 1875. They wanted to put a nice monument in Baltimore, but there wasn't room where they put him originally. So they moved him to the front of the cemetery, but they had to dig him up to do that. So he gets buried yet again. This guy just keeps getting buried. But if you guys know anything about Edgar Allan Poe stories, what's the number one rule? Nothing stays buried in an Edgar Allan Poe short story.
No. So I mean, it's almost ironic, to a T that he just keeps getting. I mean, that was one of the things. Like before we get too far, like I wanted to say the thing in the book. You wrote it the way you framed it there. It's just like the movie. It's just like when you watch movies and you have some scene. We can even take Deadpool type is where this type of thing where it's just like, it's just like, hey, so you want to know how we got to this point? And then it kind of goes from there. It's like you come back. It's like you show this is the part that everybody, like I said, everybody talks about, and then you show how we got here.
Yeah,
and then it comes. Yeah,
is because again, this guy does escape the grave. There's a line in The Pit and the Pendulum, where the narrator tells us, no, not even in the grave is all lost. That is Edgar Allan Poe, because he comes roaring back in the 20th century. We had to catch up to Poe. One of the reasons Poe is not appreciated in his lifetime is because he was so far ahead of his time. And the 20th century catches up to him. The 19th century, literature is always supposed to be about uplift. There's always supposed to be a moral to it. It's the Chautauqua movement in the second half of the 19th century. The 20th century sees things like the First World War and the Depression and the Spanish influenza and the Second World War and the introduction of nuclear weapons and the Cold War. And all of a sudden, Poe is more relevant and more resonant than he was in his own lifetime. So Poe becomes more and more alive in the 20th century. That's why I put life second, death and life. The death comes first, but guess what happens? Poe is the most recognized, best read American author in the world.
So any reason to y'all found out why they slandered his name, why he was buried and then slandered by one of his friends?
Well, the friend's name, or the guy he thought was a friend, this guy has one of the great villains' name in all time. I'm going to say the name, and you're going to be tempted to boo and hiss when I say it, because he sounds like it comes right out of a Victorian melodrama. The guy's name was Rufus Griswold. How's that for a villain's name?
I'm sorry, but every time I hear Griswold, I just instantly Chevy Chase.
Yeah,
I go instantly to Chevy Chase with the Griswolds.
Well, Rufus Griswold
Can't get left.
He kind of is in a way. He's a very he thinks he's a poet. He thinks he is the great arbiter of literary taste. So he's very jealous of Poe. For a while, they were courting the same woman, so he was probably jealous again. Poe thought that Griswold was so trustworthy, he made Griswold his literary executor.
Wow.
He trusted him that much. And Griswold's not done. He writes the obituary, and then for the rest of his life, he writes more pieces slandering Poe, upping the ante, saying things like that Poe is a drug addict, and there's no evidence that Poe ever took drugs, ever. And yet you might have heard that. You might have thought, yeah, I once heard Poe was a drug addict. Nope. Everything you probably think you know about Edgar Allan Poe is probably wrong.
Yeah, because I went into it thinking he was an alcoholic.
Yeah,
like that's all he did was just a drinker. Like just it's.
And here's the thing. I mean, this is another surprising thing about Poe. Poe dies at 40. Now, it's not a long life, but when they finally collect all of Poe's work in the early part of the 20th century, and they finally do a collected edition of Poe, it fills 17 volumes. 17 volumes, all right? And that's not everything, because we've discovered new things since that publication of that edition. Now, it's impossible for somebody to have only lived to be 40, write enough of such high quality that it will fill 17 volumes and be drunk the whole time.
Yeah.
And in truth, there's these long, long periods of sobriety that go on for 12, 14 months. Alcohol was a problem for Edgar Allan Poe. That's undeniable. But the problem was not what we think it is. He was allergic to alcohol. It took very little drink to get him roaring drunk. He would take one drink, and Poe was not the type to just savor it and sip it. He'd throw that first one back, and then it was like he'd been drinking for hours. And then it took him days to recover. It was not a simple morning hangover for Edgar Allan Poe. Poe would take days to be confined to bed to recover from it. It had a devastating effect on his system. The problem with Poe throughout his life is he always picks the wrong time to take a drink. If there's a bad time to do something, Poe does it. The phrase "his own worst enemy." There are times when in the pages of Poe's biography where you just want to reach into the pages and slap him and say, "No, not now! Don't! This is the wrong time to pick a fight. This is the wrong time to take a drink. This guy's trying to help you. Don't alienate this guy." So, that's another reason, Poe leaves behind a lot of bruised feelings.
I also heard that he went to the United States Military Academy. That's verified?
Military Academy?
Not only that, when Poe was a young man, he joins the Army. He uses a pseudonym as Edgar Perry, and he goes he enlists in Boston, and he is sent to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, near Charleston. And he's a good soldier. Poe is a very good soldier. Another misconception about Poe is that, he was this sickly, sallow-faced, sunken-eyed guy. Actually, for much of his life, Poe is very healthy and athletic. Poe was an excellent boxer. He was an excellent broad jumper. He could win any jumping contest. He was an excellent swimmer, and he was a good soldier. He was promoted very quickly to sergeant in the Army. And then when he leaves the Army, he gets into West Point as a cadet. He only stays for a few months. He doesn't have enough money to support the lifestyle of a cadet, and he also rebels under the discipline at West Point. So he basically conspires to get himself court-martialed. That was not odd at that point, but that was not strange. About 2/3 of all cadets, left West Point. West Point, no matter what you think of it today, it's multiply it by 10 by the Spartan conditions back then. The cadets were not allowed to play cards at night, play any kind of games. They were not allowed to read. The reading was thought to be frivolous. So it was basically get up bright and early, have breakfast, train, march, do drills, take classes, do more drills, take more classes. You worked your way through to dinner, and then you collapsed. So the one thing Poe got good at West Point was he and his roommate got very, very good at sneaking off campus and getting a jug from the local tavern. There was a real art to that. And one of you had to be the runner and one of you had to be the lookout. And they would trade off on who would be the runner and who would be it. And they would go to the local tavern, and then they would come up and they would keep a bottle in their room, and then everybody would come by their room for a shot. So that's the art that he actually mastered at West Point. Was
getting back, Mark, to his bad choices and the use of alcohol at times when you shouldn't be doing it. If it were not for that, would he be known today for what he has done? I mean, and also, you're talking about 17 volumes, I think you said, or was it 7?
17.
17 volumes. Okay, so if you consider that, it's a lot. It's a lot of work. But if you get back into the time frame of when this was taking place, there were many social outlets. You spent a lot of time at home, a lot of time with yourself and your thoughts. So, I mean, it can be done. But I think that if it wasn't for him doing these really stupid things, he would never have been able to, develop what he did.
The real kind of defining moment for Poe is, Poe is orphaned at a very young age. His father deserts the family, dies very quickly afterward. His mother, who is an actress, dies before he's 3 years old. And he's taken in by the Allens, a merchant family in Richmond. And John Allan was a very stern, very dour merchant. And he and Poe do not get along. The older Poe gets, the more they and he never adopts Poe. He never formally adopts Poe, and he always makes Poe feel like a charity case because of that. But when Poe is a young man, an adult, there's a break between them. And John Allan, who becomes one of the wealthiest men, he inherits a lot from an uncle. He becomes one of the wealthiest merchants in Richmond. Poe's belief is that he is going to become part of the Virginia aristocracy. He is going to inherit and live the life of a Virginia gentleman. He is cut off without a penny. When John Allan dies, John Allan leaves money to illegitimate children. He leaves no money to Edgar Allan Poe at all. If he had left even a fraction of that fortune to Poe, Poe would have been well off for the rest of his life. What happens, though, is if Poe had inherited the money, he probably would have never written the stories and the poems we know him for.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So
that's the turning point right there. If Poe has to become a working writer and he determines he's going to be the first person to actually make his living solely as a literary man. Not even Washington Irving could pull that one off. Everybody had government jobs or day jobs of some kind. They worked at universities. They worked in local parishes. Poe battles poverty for the rest of his life, but he has to turn to writing short stories as a form of income. So he's the master of it. I mean, this is where he's really the best of the best. There's nobody who can touch him as a short story writer, particularly in the realm of mystery and horror. And these are his greatest accomplishments. And he would probably not have written. He would have, if he had become a gentleman of the aristocracy, he probably would have been a gentleman poet and essayist, and maybe he would have a minor reputation. But he's forced into it. He's forced into writing the stuff that we remember him for. Thank goodness.
But they say he was only paid around $9 or $10 per.
There are no copyright laws. There are no copyright laws to protect you. So the first publication, say he sells something to a New York newspaper, they give him $9 or whatever, and then it can be reprinted up and down the coast in every newspaper in America for free because nobody's going to pay him again. So he made a pitiful amount of money off of his writing, and that's why he does battle poverty his whole life.
Wow. So it makes me wonder, did he really start drinking after his wife died? Because his wife died.
No. He takes his first drink at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville as a student there.
And like Animal House.
All of the accounts are the same. From then on, all the accounts of Poe drinking is the same, which is that whenever he takes a drink, it incapacitates him. And it's a recurring problem throughout his life, all the way to the end. But it is not the problem we think it is, because we have on record these moments of 12, 14 months. During those 12 and 14 months, he's amazingly prolific. He's laser locked on what he's doing. And, fame has been a double-edged sword for Mr. Poe. We know him today, and we instantly recognize his name, his face, and several of the stories like The Raven and The Telltale Heart and The Cask of Amontillado. And the reason we do is because he was so good at those things. But it's a little bit of what he wrote. Poe never would have considered himself a horror writer. Poe would have never considered himself a mystery writer. Poe would have just considered himself a writer, period. You know, it's like, well,
Wow.
I'm writing criticism, I'm writing this, I'm writing that. As a matter of fact, no major horror writer of the 19th century would have considered themselves a horror writer. They wouldn't have known what you were talking about if you had told them, you're a horror writer. Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, Robert Louis Stevenson. They would have looked at you and like, what are you talking about? I mean, you mean I
where's
write
horror?
That idea of branding, where you have to pick what kind of writer you're, that's a 20th century American conceit. That is not the 19th century. So
Wow.
if the mood took him and he decided to write a spooky story, he would. But he wrote as much humor as he did horror. We just don't read the humor. He was funny. That's another thing you don't think about Edgar Allan Poe. You don't think of Poe as being a comedy writer or being at all funny or having a sense of humor.
And
Guess what? He did.
He was rather romantic as well.
Oh yeah,
He was very much romantic, but it never the transition to that. It's not like a Byron, where it's all love, or the Songs of Solomon. It was like it's kind of like Arnold Schwarzenegger becoming a ballet dancer.
Well, Poe, Lord Byron is his hero. He patterns himself after Lord Byron, and he dresses in black. He views himself primarily as a romantic poet. I think if you had to pick one thing, that may have been what he picked. But it's like somebody in the book said, one of the people I interviewed for the book said, he set out to be Lord Byron. He did better than Byron. Who reads Byron today? Who the hell reads Byron? Everybody reads Edgar Allan Poe. Everybody gets Edgar Allan Poe. He did better than Byron. He did Edgar Allan Poe, and that's much better than Lord Byron. So, but that fame has been very, it's been a double edge because it's kept him alive. Those few stories, that handful of stories, have kept him alive in poems. But it's also kept us from seeing the whole artist, the guy who actually wrote those stories. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was that if you say Edgar Allan Poe to somebody, they probably got an image in their mind. And the image that they probably got was of some guy, sickly, pale, sitting up in an attic somewhere, surrounded by cobwebs and dust, writing with a quill pen, and a raven perched on his shoulder, and a red-eyed black cat prowling through the dust, and he's spinning off these stories and fever dreams fueled by alcohol and drugs. And that's the stereotype. That's sort of the grotesque funhouse mirror reflection we've made of Poe. And except for the quill pen, nothing about that is true. Not a bit of it is true. And, Poe was healthy most of his life. He didn't wear a mustache most of his life. It was only to the last 2 years that he adopted the mustache. He had a sense of humor. He had friends. He had lots of friends. And he was an extremely versatile, dedicated writer. That's the key. That's the whole point, is Poe never stopped revising what he did. He was always looking for the exact right word, and he was always changing things all the way to the last second. That's why he was such a master at what he did. He didn't write those things because of some streak of insanity, or because, when I was in high school, and my high school teacher taught me Poe wrong, because they taught me, as maybe you were taught, to confuse Poe with his unreliable narrators. That in some way they were a reflection of who Poe was. That Poe was the guy in the Telltale Heart, and Poe was the guy in the Raven talking to the bird. And that's selling him short as an artist. That's selling him way short as an artist. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to sort of smash the funhouse mirror and take a look at who the real Edgar Allan Poe was.
It's very interesting. He's one of my favorite, if not my favorite author of the past. Byron is also one of my favorite poets. I do a lot of poetry myself, and which is music as well. But something I think of every time I think of Edgar Allan Poe is I first think of the VMI West Point military cape that he seemed to have adopted most of his life. But I can't get out of my mind in this current day and age Christopher Walken doing the Raven, the actor. It is just, it's brilliant, and it's perfect, and it's that whole image. I mean, he's just an amazing character.
and Poe believed in music, and Poe wrote about music, and Poe said that music was the highest form. And there's a lot of parallel between his writing, not just the poetry, but all of his writing, and music. And one of the great things and he was musical, by the way. He played instruments. He and his wife would play duets when they would go out. Something else we don't think of Poe doing. But Poe, one of the things that just has been said about his poetry in particular, but I think it's true about his writing as well, and the short stories as well, is it's almost impossible not to fully appreciate them unless you read them out loud. And it's true. Several of Poe's stories are perfect monologues. He did not write for the theater. He did come from a theatrical. Both his parents were actors. But writing for the theater during his time was not considered a high literary pursuit. That does not come until the last part of the 1900s. So he doesn't really write for the theater, but he wrote perfect monologue. The Telltale Heart's a perfect monologue. Do you know how many people have performed? It's 5,000 words. It takes about 15 minutes to perform. How many people have performed The Telltale Heart or The Cask of Amontillado?
Quite a few. I mean, I'm not like I said, this is, we'll set the political whole thing aside. One of the best readings for me, especially like the Telltale Heart, is by Glenn Beck.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
He does it every year. Like that's like his ritual thing. And that was one of the first times I'd actually heard it orally read, and it was through the radio. And so it was just one of those things. It was a combination of the way he read it, just a little bit of the sound effects that they added in there. But it had that amazing impact of just listening to it, because it's one of those things, the way Poe wrote. And that's the thing, especially for me, when I read a book, it doesn't matter what the book is. In my mind, I'm crafting all the imagery.
Yeah.
And in his work, you could literally picture the wooden planks, the chair as the police officers, as officers come in, set it down, sit there. You could hear, you can see the old man, the hole with the sliver of the light as it shoots forth. I mean, you can picture all this stuff just through his writing, and that's the part that it was so fantastic when you would read these things.
And that's a very good point, because that's what separated Poe. Poe wrote with all his senses. That's something that very few writers actually do. Most writers give you a lot of plot. They'll give you a lot of dialogue to move things along, and they forget that we have five senses. And Poe wrote with all. You cannot. As you said, you could see the differences in light in The Telltale Heart. He plays with what you see, and he makes you see it. But he not only makes you see it, he makes you feel it. You can smell that room. You can
almost get the anxiety along with him as he's trying to slowly crack open the light to just let a little bit out.
And now he's playing with sound too. He's not just playing with the light. Mm-hmm. He's playing with sound, because the littlest scratch of the latch makes the old man bolt up and say, "Who's there?" And that's that moment where it's sound, and he's always giving you that. He's playing with sound. He's playing with light. He's playing with smell. He's giving you a tremendous, what writers call a sense of place, and that's what does separate Poe. Poe was not the only writer of his time writing horror stories. The magazines were full of them. They were just full of them. He was just that much better than anyone else at what he was doing. And that's why we don't read the rest of the people who were writing them back then. We still read Poe. And it's why we give kids in the 7th grade Poe. Yep. My father, in the Depression, in the 1930s, got Edgar Allan Poe and loved Edgar Allan Poe. And right on down, you talk to anybody, they got Poe in school, whether they were in private school, public school, parochial school, whatever, they got Poe. And they probably got him around the 7th grade. And then you've got him again in the 8th grade, 9th grade, all the way through high school. And then if you took a literary course in college, you got him again. Mm-hmm. So the educational system has been while other writers have been dropping out of curriculum left and right, Poe stays in curriculum. And he stays in curriculum at a point where you get him in the 7th grade. Now think about that for a second. How many people did you know when you were in the 7th grade liked to read?
Yeah.
Right?
Not many.
Right.
Not many.
Reading was a bloody chore. And then we give 7th graders Edgar Allan Poe. What's Poe doing? He's locking people up in torture chambers. He's walling them up in catacombs. He's dismembering corpses. He's
Dismembering an old guy, burying him in the floorboards, and lying to the police.
Swinging knives.
Yes, and we give this to 7th graders. Now, can you imagine giving them contemporary stories in the 7th grade about the very same things? You'd have a hue and cry from one end of the country to the next if you gave kids these stories. And these stories were by modern authors. But because it's Edgar Allan Poe, and because everybody's gone through this rite of passage, nobody raises an eyebrow about it. It's like, oh, good, they're getting Poe. That's great. That's wonderful. And what a great thing to get to fire up your imagination in the 7th grade. All of a sudden, reading isn't a bloody chore. It's bloody fun.
But that's the key to Poe. So what you want to do is to engage a young child to read, like myself. That's when I didn't like to read before that, but what was great was I can use I do what you do, Craig. I kind of figure out who the characters, I create these characters or these scenes in my head. So I'm actually watching this as a movie internally, waiting for the next part. And if you engage young people in that manner and get them excited enough, they'll continue to read. But one of the things in current day, and I've said this for a bunch of years now, at least 20 years, when all these people started doing all these Broadway converts, like the producers and all these other shows, Poe someone has to go out there and make a play based on his life story, throwing in some of the literary work in there. I think it would be fantastic for Broadway. It may be sacrilegious because I don't think he was a fan of it, but combine that with the current state of Hollywood, where all they do is remake the same movie over and over again. All you got to do is take any one of the stories that Edgar Allan Poe put together and write a screenplay off of it. It's just as scary as anything you'll see today. It would be genius.
It's like what Wes Craven told me, that Poe didn't invent fear; he understood it. He understood it better than anybody who ever put their attention to the horror story. And but what you just said is it goes hand in hand with the whole idea that the one of Poe's best friends has been the education system, that the fact that we keep Poe in curriculum and we keep reintroducing him. He's our renewable energy source when it comes to literature. So that's one of the great things about Poe. But hand in hand with that, is the other good friend all through the 20th century. The other one working hand in hand with the education system has been the pop culture. Poe has got so much street cred, it's not funny. He's got more street cred than any other writer, period. He's on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He's not only on the cover, he's got the top center position. He's name-checked in songs by John Lennon and Bob Dylan. The Telltale Heart has been done for everything from The Simpsons to SpongeBob SquarePants. Poe has shown up as a character on South Park and The Simpsons. And you can go all the way back to the 1930s, and that was the kind of the start of it. The Universal horror movies, when they made their Poe movies, which had about as much authenticity to Poe as the Roger Corman films did, but they're all wonderful in their own way. So you start with the Raven and the Black Cat and the Murders in the Rue Morgue with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. And then you work your way all the way through into the 60s. And then we get the Roger Corman films with Vincent Price, those wonderfully stylish films. And then you work your way through generation to generation. Poe is always there. And he always has this incredible street cred. He's always, everybody kind of, and I think it is again, because we all get Poe. You got Poe, I got Poe, all God's children get Poe. We all get Poe. At the right age, and we carried on. And the sad thing is, a lot of times the American educational system, I think it's almost designed to give kids the wrong thing to read at the wrong time, so it will kill off their love of reading. You can very easily do that by giving the kid the wrong book. And it's like, I always want to say, give me the selection process for 5 minutes, and I will get them, juiced up about writing. you know. And instead it seems like they're determined to do that.
Oh yeah, we have to end up reading some like Grapes of Wrath or something like that, and you're just like, oh.
Well, it's when you get
Ugh.
it. It's not so much what the book is, but when you get it.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, there's nothing wrong with Steinbeck, but you're not ready for Steinbeck.
No.
You know, at that point, it's like you're not ready for Tale of Two Cities in high school. You know,
No.
Tale of Two Cities will kill off any kid's love of reading in high school. It's a great book once you're in your 20s.
War and Peace, and you're just like, I'm done. I'm not reading another book.
But give them Christmas Carol at that age.
Yeah.
Give them the story of Scrooge and ghosts and haunting and you know, and it's a smaller book and it's a very accessible book, and that's a good choice, you know. But don't give them great expectations of Tale of Two Cities. They're not ready for it. Don't give them great expectations or the Grapes of Wrath until they're ready for it. You know, you bring them along. So Poe is just perfect. He's one of the things they do right. He's one of the things that the educational system does right. Thank goodness.
Yeah, I wasn't too thrilled about Shakespeare, believe it or not.
Oh no, that
was just like, oh God, no.
Shakespeare is a light switch, and you have to wait for the switch to go on. And it goes on at different points for different ages. There's a point you're going to be sitting in a Shakespeare play, and you go, "It's English. I get it now." And it all comes up. It's like the light goes on up there. But exactly, it's a very good point.
I prefer the West Side Story Shakespeare.
Yeah,
little singing, a little dancing, you know.
Mark, I have a question for you. Arthur Quinn has, you know, about what's considered the definitive biography of Poe. You know, about nearly 80 years later, you come along. What new insights did you find, or you know, some new information that adds to Quinn's biography?
I don't think I know if it's new information as much as it is a new approach. You know, my idea, I wanted to write Arthur Hobson Quinn's book is a very academic book. It's a wonderful book. It was the first attempt to put what had then been almost 90 years of misinformation to rest. He was really trying to set the record straight. And there's been a lot of scholarship since Quinn's book appeared in 1940. But Quinn's book, and Mark, I don't know if you've read Quinn's book or have tried to read Quinn's book.
I've read a good bit of it.
It's a bit of a slog. You know, Quinn is not, Quinn was an academic, very scholarly writer. And it's not really, I make no pretensions about being an academic. I'm not, I'm a working writer. So I set out to write a biography that was the biography written by a working writer about a working writer. And so my approach was different. My approach was not one of a scholar. And I was not setting out to write the definitive academic scholarly work on Edgar Allan Poe. There are better people for that. At least there better be better people for that. I set out to write a popular biography of Poe. I set out to be a book that would be entertaining to read, engaging to read, but would come up to the standards of a biographer. I also was a journalist for 43 years. So I also approached this book using the skills of I can't pretend to be a writer. I'm not. I can't all of a sudden pretend I'm some kind of stuffy academic who's worked in academia and all this time. And that's the way I'm going to all of a sudden write. So I used the skills of a journalist when I did this book, and I took chances with this book. I knew I was taking chances with this book. One of the major chances I took with this book was already mentioned. A dual timeline. In other words, the chapters alternate between the last 4 months of Poe's life and then the various sections of his life leading up to those 4 months until the two timelines meet in the end. And then I give you what my theory is on how he died and wrap everything up. So that was what most biographies are linear. You start with birth and move to death. I decided to shake that up a little bit and do a non-traditional approach and try to make it a little bit more, maybe filmic might not be a bad word. I was also using the skills of a novelist at certain to paint certain scenes. And then
Well, my opinion, you achieved it. So yeah, I mean,
well,
that's,
well, thank you. I mean,
yeah.
I knew I was the second major risk I took was doing interviews. You know, like how do you do interviews for somebody who died in 1849? There's nobody alive who knew Edgar Allan Poe. There's nobody alive who knew anybody who knew Edgar Allan Poe. So I knew I was taking a chance by using the skills of a journalist and going to leading experts on Poe who have studied minute little aspects of Poe's life, and asking them questions and quoting them about what does this mean? What does Poe's time in Charleston mean? What does Poe's and Southern identity mean? What about Poe's relationship with Boston? There are people who've spent their whole lives studying that. I would be a fool not to use that and take that in. I also approached it as a detective, if you will, on a case. And what does a detective do? They interview witnesses. Who are my witnesses? The Poe scholars and biographers. They were my witnesses. I interviewed forensic pathologists and forensic archaeologists. I interviewed an FBI agent, crime writers, and horror writers. I went to people who were good at what Poe did. So I talked to Stephen King. I talked to Anne Rice. I talked to Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho. Vincent Price is quoted in this book. Because they would understand the psychology of what it would take to write great horror better than any. Wes Craven is another person I talked to for the book. And their insights were amazing. Their insights are all throughout the book. But that's a chance. That's taking a huge chance with a biography, because you know, when you take those kinds of big chances, you know you're going off the high diving board.
Yep.
And you also know one other thing. You have no idea whether there's any water in the pool or not. You're going to find out when you get down there. And so when you say that, you know, you think it works, that's great, because that means there was water in the pool when I got down there. But
yep.
Mark, when you were forget the writers, you know, all the big writers, but when you were talking to the academics and the individuals that spent their money and time and effort and energy focusing on Edgar Allan Poe and little snippets here or this type, or and I don't mean any disrespect for anybody who's doing this, but your take on it, did you ever find that someone that was supposed to be an expert on specific or Poe, whatever, was just like, this person really doesn't know what they're talking about? They don't get it.
No, I wouldn't say that, but you know, there's always going to be disagreement.
Right.
Poe did not live a well-documented life. So a lot of what we know about Poe, we have filled in with speculation. And any biographer is sooner or later is going to fall back on such words as undoubtedly, maybe, perhaps. You no matter who, even with a well-documented life, you have to use those words every once in a while. With Poe, you're using them all the time, because there are a lot of times in his life which we don't have much documentation for. Now, had he lived into this, had he been born say 20 years later, he would have had a very well documented life. We would have known a lot more about him than we know now. Mark Twain is born in 1835. Mark Twain is a very well documented life. We almost know where Twain is almost every single day of his 74 years on the planet. With Poe, it's only 40 years, and there are months that go undocumented. There's whole periods of time when there's no record for Poe. So it was that. But more importantly, with the academics, what I did with them was I asked them before we started talking, don't try to sound important. Don't try to sound like an academic. Talk like we're having a conversation. Now, from that came amazing things. Came from amazing things. I just encouraged them to speak as colorfully as they could in making whatever points. I'll give you an example of that. One of the the very fine Poe scholars I interviewed was Edward Pettit, who is at the Rosenbeck Museum in Philadelphia. Now, Poe spent most of his time in his life in 5 major American cities, and they are all the ones associated the most with Poe. He's born in Boston. He grows up in Richmond. He lives in Baltimore for a little while, and he dies in Baltimore. And he's living in New York for the last about 5 years of his life, and that's where he's living actually when he dies. The city that sort of gets left out in all of this is Philadelphia. He lives in Philadelphia for about 6 years of his adult life. That's not an inconsiderable amount of time for somebody who only lives to be 40. But those 6 years are the golden years. It's those 6 years when he writes almost all the stories we know him for, and many of almost it is definitely his hot streak. So I was talking to Ed Pettit about this, and Ed's in Philadelphia, and I said, talk about the importance of Philadelphia. And Ed says, look, when you go into the Baseball Hall of Fame, you go in under the uniform for the team with which you put up your big numbers. Poe put up his big numbers here in Philadelphia. What a great way to put it. No academic would have put that if I was interviewing them as an academic, but I encourage them to put this, in as colorful a way as they can. And as soon as he said it, I thought that's gold. That's going in the book. This is, why should we associate Philadelphia with Poe? Because he put up his big numbers here. This is where he hit his home runs. That's why. So I got this again and again from the academics by having these real conversations about Edgar Allan Poe, instead of having these very stuffy, highfalutin conversations.
Yeah, one of the things I was trying to figure out how to word it too, was as I was reading your book, and it almost seemed the way, like when he narrates his stories, it's almost as if he's using it as an outlet, like almost like the counseling. Like the stuff he went through his life, it's like he's able to get some of those things out through his works. Like he's actually just, and that was the way. It's just when I was reading it, it's like some of the stuff, like where as a literary critic, it almost felt to me like that was his way for the treatment of his father got, where his mom was so successful, but his father was so lampooned as just basically a hack. It was almost like it's like, well, I'm going to turn around, and it's almost like it was retribution. I'm gonna treat them the same way that they treated my father.
He wrote revenge stories, He wrote a couple of dandy revenge stories.
Yep.
Cask of Amontillado is, who you walling up, Edgar? The thing we miss about the Cask of Amontillado, it's a funny story. It's a very funny story. He's got humor all through that. It's a very grim idea. The idea that one man is luring another man to his certain death and is going to die a very slow, agonizing death. It's an awful story in one sense, but it's got a black humor to it that runs all through it. But yeah, I don't think any writer is capable of not cathartically dealing with their lives and their emotions in their stories. I think that's undoubtedly true. Look, there's a lot of young women who die in Poe's stories, and Poe lost a lot of women in his life. A lot of loved women die in Poe's life. Young women in Poe stories and poems are something of an endangered species. They usually don't make it to the end of the story or the poem. How many of Poe's stories are about lost love? Annabel Lee, The Raven, Ligeia. It goes on and on. Sure. I think that Poe is, you use what you have as a writer. You always use what you have, and writing is very cathartic. Rod Serling turned to writing to cathartically deal with the horrors of World War II that he had seen. He discovered that writing was a way of coping with his war memories. So sure, yeah, I don't think there's any question of that. However, I do think where you don't want to do is take the next step and make the mistake. See, Poe's first great defenders were the French, led by Baudelaire. Baudelaire idolized Poe. And Baudelaire was so outraged by what Rufus Griswold had wrote that he launched offenses of Poe from France. He at one point refers to Griswold as a pedagogic vampire. On another occasion, looking how Griswold was basically urinating on Poe's grave. Baudelaire famously asks, "Are there not ordinances in the United States prohibiting dogs from running loose in your cemeteries?" Ooh, so he's really going after Griswold here. But Baudelaire and his disciples replaced one stereotype with another, and the stereotype they replaced it with was the notion that Poe was touched with insanity, that the reason Poe could write all this stuff was because he had a touch of madness. And that was a romantic notion of them, and they liked that. And that's as wrong-headed as anything. Yes, Poe was using what was in his life. Yes, he was dealing with it. But that does not mean that Poe then becomes the narrator of the Cask of Amontillado. It does not mean that Poe then is that guy, or the guy in The Raven talking to the bird. This is where he takes those things and he makes art of them. He probes those things, those human emotions, like any great writer does, and he makes great art of them. Not because he's mad himself, but because he's in total control of his art. That's how he does it.
Do you think if Poe left the States and went over to France, where he was, regarded more highly, we would have had a totally different result of Poe, and maybe he would have lived a little bit longer in his life?
No.
During the celebration.
I do resist sort of the the speculation, because there's a lot of with anybody who dies at 40, there's going to be speculation. The what ifs, not as many with Poe as you'd think. The big one with Poe is always what would have happened if he'd lived another 10 years and the United States enters into the unpleasantries. What happens with the Civil War? What does Poe do? A lot of the historical assumption is always, Poe would have joined the Confederacy. He considered Virginia his home. He grew up in Richmond, and his sympathies would have been with the Confederacy. That's a little too easy to sort of jump to that conclusion, because Poe's politics were also Whiggish, and the Whigs become the Republicans. So he may have, and he was living in the North almost as much as he considered Richmond his hometown. Once he moves north in the 1830s, he's there for the rest of his life. He's basically living in either Philadelphia or New York for the rest of his life. So I think it's a little, again, it's like any other, it can very quickly enter into, would Spartacus have won if he'd had a Piper Cub type of discussion? Is you after a while, well, we don't know. We know what did happen. But I will say this about his literary output, which is, I think, the most important thing. There's a long heritage and history of writers who die in that sweet spot of 40 to 45. Jack London died in that sweet spot. Flannery O'Connor, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Robert Louis Stevenson, Anton Chekhov. There's this whole group of writers who die between 40 and 45. And Poe dies at 40. He's right in there with them. With the rest of them, we always sort of say, there is that kind of immediate speculation of what would they have written had they lived? Because writers are supposed to be coming into their prime at 40. 40 to 60 is supposed to be the sweet spot for writers. That's the age when you have enough experience as a writer and enough life experience to really turn out your mature masterpieces. And we do ask that about Fitzgerald, and we do ask that about Flannery O'Connor and other writers. We don't really ask that about Poe very much. And I think one of the reasons is because there is sort of a complete arc to Poe's literary achievement. There's almost this sense that he did what he was meant to do when he was here. And nobody kind of asked that question. Gee, I wonder what Poe would have written if he lived. And maybe that's because we're still getting so much of what he left behind.
Given what he wrote, though, I think you would just be enthralled with what was taking place between within, that conflict within the massive amounts of bodies, the death, the bloodshed. I think he really would have pulled some really wonderful things out of it. Maybe even more on the poetic side versus the macabre-ish type of style.
It could be, because remember, in some ways his children take up the task. I mean, Whitman becomes the poet of the Civil War, and Bierce becomes the short story writer of the Civil War. And Ambrose Bierce is very much, in some ways, in the tradition of Poe, carrying on. Bierce is a terrific, and Bierce is the only kind of fiction writer who comes out of the Civil War who was there. You talk about somebody who wrote with all his senses. You read his war stories from the Civil War, and this is clearly somebody who saw action, who can describe what it was like to be in the midst of cannon fire. And so, in some sense, we do get it from Poe, because Poe, I mean, one thing that Poe does not get enough credit for, and we've mentioned this a couple of times, is he was best known in his lifetime as a literary critic, but don't go past that too good. He was a really good critic. He was excellent. If you read his criticism, it's not only incredibly well written and insightful, it's trustworthy. He was good. The people he praised deserve to be praised and have lived. The people he went after, we've forgotten. He correctly, he gets a lot of heat for going after the reigning literary figures of his time, which were the Boston literary elite. They were unquestionably the most popular. They were the gatekeepers of American literature at the time. Poe thought they were a bunch of stuffy, self-important individuals who were bad for literature. And Poe believed that American literature would never come into its own until it broke free. It broke the shackles of Europe in general, and England in particular. And the Boston people thought the best writing was the one that came closest to an English standard. Poe's out there basically saying nonsense. And he's lobbying for a true American literature. And he, in some ways, so Poe is not only a genius in his own right as a writer, he's also kind of like the John the Baptist of our American literature. He's out there in the wilderness saying, we need this, we need this. And it's going to be fulfilled by people like Mark Twain and Ambrose Bierce and Walt Whitman. They are going to be the ones who fulfill what Poe's calling for in a lot of ways. So, he's a very good critic. The horror writers love Poe. They claim Poe because, and with good reason. Nobody was better at writing the psychological horror story than Poe. The mystery writers claim Poe because he created the modern detective story with his C. Auguste Dupin, who was the role model for Sherlock Holmes. The mystery writers on him. Even the science fiction writers will say, well, Poe wrote science fiction. Everybody sort of wants Poe playing on their team. The one group that sort of doesn't claim Poe are the critics, and they should, because as George Bernard Shaw recognized, he was good. He was really, really good at being a critic.
The profilers quote Poe as well.
Oh, that one was a complete gift, because one of the people I interviewed for the book was John Douglas, who is the pioneer FBI agent in developing profiling, the profiling bureau. I wanted to talk to John Douglas basically to get his opinion on Poe's death, to get his opinion on it as a case. And, ultimately he told me what I kind of already knew, which was it's not solvable. It's not solvable with modern forensics, with modern profiling, with modern techniques. It's not a case that he would consider definitively solvable. But he gave me something else in the middle of this that I hadn't seen or anticipated. John Douglas then says, but I think it's shortchanging Poe by just saying that he is the father of the modern detective story. He is, in fact, the father of modern profiling. Is the way Poe attached logic and analytical approach to his crime stories anticipates the techniques of modern profiling. And I would have never given Poe that, but if John Douglas gives it to him, that's an immense credit.
Well,
So that was a piece of gold I was not looking for. I wasn't digging for that. Poe wrote Poe was interested in everything. One of the reasons he was a good horror writer was he was interested in absolutely everything. He was interested in languages, in travel, in geography, in rocks, in plants, you name it. He was interested. He read about
space.
everything. And Poe believed in his own genius. And he believed he was smart enough to be able to come up with a theory that unified everything. And he tried it. He wrote a piece called Eureka, which many people believe anticipates modern physics. Now, I think it's a little overstated. I think but there are people who believe that, this was a mind who actually may have in some ways anticipated modern physics as well as modern profiling.
We have a quick question from a guest. If Poe was still alive, do you think he would meet the social media standards of today, the community standards of social media?
I think Poe would have been canceled 20 times over if he was alive today. Poe was not easy. Let me put it. I don't want to make a saint of Edgar Allan Poe. I think Poe is just the type of person who would have to send an overheated, Twitter out and created a woke mob in 10 seconds. Poe was perfectly capable of that. Poe is I think Poe would have been a difficult friend. I would have loved to have been his friend. I would have loved to have tried to help him, but I do think Poe was the very definition of high maintenance. Like one Poe scholar said, if you had lived in Poe's time and there was a knock on the door and you had one of those little peepholes, you could look through the door and you saw it was Edgar Allan Poe, you might pretend you were not home. And I thought that's a very good description. I think there are times when Poe just made it very, very difficult to be not only your friend, but his own friend, because he just constantly takes the wrong time to pick a fight or take a drink. And Poe wrote a story called The Imp of the Perverse. It's sort of this idea that you become obsessed with the very thing you shouldn't do. And it becomes so all-consuming, and finally you have to give in to the imp of the perverse. Poe had the imp of the perverse. There's no question he did. He understood that because he was a victim to it.
I can just think about what he would write every time he got thrown in Facebook jail.
Oh, yeah.
That first post probably would have maxed out.
He was very sensitive. It would
just keep coming, and he would have gotten tagged for every one of those posts. Like, you're in jail for 30 days now.
Yep. And remember too, that I think there are some things where he would do very well. The criticism that he wrote back then, I think he would be very good today. I think as a critical voice, he would be a very strong voice. He would be looked at like a very erudite, very good voice on the culture and everything around him. I think that, but he would be writing in a very different era. If he were around today, he would be surrounded by, he wouldn't be the exception. He would be surrounded by, thousands of people who were doing what he did, what he created. Look at all the mystery writers out there. Look at all the horror writers who are out there. It would be a different playing field, so it's very hard to say how he would fit in today.
And I got to be honest, I think intellectually, most people couldn't comprehend what he was trying to communicate. He was, I'll call it straight up. A lot of the people today think they're intelligent or smart or witty, and they so lack the necessary skills, just the basic foundation to actually grok a lot of what's being taken place. And that would have probably frustrated the heck out of him if he was here right now.
Yeah, it probably would have, and also because, again, it frustrated him just because of the fact that he knew he was better than everybody else. I mean, everybody else sort of looked down on him as a writer in his time, and he knew it had to be a very lonely place to be.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite stories about Edgar Allan Poe is that after he completed The Raven, and he worked on it for quite a while, but he was living in New York at the time. And after he completed the Raven, he went for a walk. And he meets a friend, a young friend of his, on the streets of New York. And the friend says, "Oh, Poe, how are you?" And Poe says, "I'm great. I'm fabulous. I have just completed the greatest poem ever written." And the friend doesn't know how to respond to that. How do you? He sort of said, "Well, that's nice. That's nice." And then Poe says, "No, you don't understand. I have just written the greatest poem ever written." So Poe proceeds to perform the Raven. It's the first performance of the Raven to an audience of one on the streets of New York. He recites the Raven to this guy. And when he's done, he looks at him like, "Well, didn't I tell you?" And the friend says, "Well, that is fine." And Poe says, "Fine? Fine? It's the greatest poem ever written." He knew what he had done. Now,
Yep.
Look, writers are notoriously insecure. Any writer will tell you, you get done with something, you don't know whether you've done anything of any value. You second guess yourself. We all suffer from imposter syndrome. Poe knew what he'd done when he'd finished the Raven. That's Mozart. That's one of those exceptions that somebody who has that much confidence in their own genius, he did know. He did understand. And, he correctly predicted that, he was going to live and Longfellow wouldn't. Now, who reads Longfellow today? Now, Longfellow he's the superstar. He's the guy whose poems are being read in front of fireplaces all across the country. He's the one whose works are considered immortal. And Poe's sort of saying, he ain't going to last a generation. And he's right. He's right.
If it wasn't a sign, he really Longfellow wouldn't. I don't think he would have. He would keep going. But there's something to touch on what you just said about his. I don't think it was an arrogance or an attitude. It's really interesting. So when you come up with something or you create something, be it artwork or music or lyrics or whatever, when you have something, when you're on something, I don't know if it's the sixth sense. You just know, and it's not really arrogance. You just know. Oh my God, this is great. It just fills all the it ticks off everything you need to get. And the problem is, it's not that your society just follows like sheep. And if one person says, "Well, that's terrible," then it's terrible. And they just, if they don't get it, they don't get it. But it is dramatic and it's wonderful. I don't think it's arrogance as much as of that. But there's something about when you do something the right way, you just know it, like you've just your own name.
Poe would not have thought it was arrogance. Poe would have just thought it was matter of fact. Poe would have looked at you and said, I'm not bragging. I'm just telling you this. Don't you understand?" And most people did not understand. Most people in his life did not understand how good he was and why he was so good at what he did. There's so little. I talked to one Poe scholar very, very early on. One of the first conversations I had for the book, and was talking about how Poe dies at 40, and he dies with very little reputation and almost no money. I said, you want to be able to reach back and tell him, "Don't worry, you're the guy who's going to make it. You're the one. You wish he knew." And this Poe scholar looked at me and said, "I think he knew." And then I thought about it for a second. I said, "I think you're right. I think he knew."
Yeah. It's unfortunate that any heirs, was pre-ownership and X, Y, and Z, and copyright laws are well out of play right now.
Oh yeah.
But
everything regarding Poe is in the public domain and has been for a long, long time.
It's not like the music industry where after 7 years you get a right to do a remix your master and then you own it again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sad. That also adds to his story and the darkness and the depression. It's really great.
As we're wrapping it up here, I got to show you this. When I was doing my notes, I doodled Edgar Allan Poe. But for me, I think it looks like the love child of George Norrie from Coast to Coast from Edgar Allan Poe.
Now that's scary.
Yeah. So so I was doing my notes. I was like, but yeah, for me, It's my George Nori Poe.
Nevermore.
Yeah, but no, it was. But I wanted to show before we wrap it up here too, because as we're running out of time, I wanted to show for people, Amazon.com is real quick and easy way to get this book.
Yes.
Yep, just click right there. You can get
It's
it.
an excellent book.
Yeah, if you have Prime, you can get it next day.
Yeah.
So like me right now, I could order. Like I said, anybody that's got the Prime thing, like right where we're at right now, you could order it right now, and it shows up tomorrow.
Something, and this is just me,
Mhm.
but I understand that the appeal of a Kindle. Get a hard copy, like a paperback. Get a physical book. Dog ear the pages. Get into it. Hold it. When you have an electronic piece of junk in front of you, yeah, it's great to travel if you want to download. Get both of them, but pick up a physical book for the love of God.
Tom has it right. Nori Poe. That's the name of that.
Hold
That's the
on
name of
to
my
a
art.
book.
Nori
Take a
Poe.
look at the pages.
I'm writing that. That's now the title of my work. It's Nori Poe.
Nori Poe.
And Mark, you quote Mark Olshaker a few times in the book. He's been a guest a couple times on the Three Beards podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, and Mark, because I've known Mark for a long time, and we obviously there's a Twilight Zone connection there as well with Mark, but also because Mark is a very astute student of the true crime genre and the co-author on the Mindhunter series. So what he had to contribute was what I couldn't have done better on interviews for this book. I really loved the range of people that I got and the range of expertise that I got. And again, that I did feel did feel like a detective on the case.
And Dan Stashower
Dan's a great
his American Demon is been a very popular true crime book that's been out for just a few months.
Dan's a honey of a writer. Dan Stashower Dan wrote one of my favorite biographies. The biography he wrote of Arthur Conan Doyle is a wonderful read. And he also wrote a book about Poe. He wrote a book about a true crime.
Cigar Girl.
The Cigar Girl that Poe turned into The Mystery of Marie Roget, the second Dupin story. So, there's everybody who Matthew Pearl, everybody who contributed something to this book, contributed something of great worth.
And as for everybody, for me, I'm directly opposed to dog-earing a book. I'm one of those ones. I've already read half of this book that is coming up here, and you can see I have not even. The spine isn't even creased.
Spine is opening, Craig. No, I agree with you. When I have a bunch of books that I keep really pristine.
It's like nails on a chalkboard when I watch them go like this. I'm like, I can't do it.
But I think we should also, because Mark mentioned it, maybe we should all chip in and get Mark something. I shared a screen with you. We'll just get it for him for the next show. Maybe if you want to contribute, just talk to Craig.
A GoFundMe so Mark can feel part of it.
GoFundMe for Mark. So
but wait a minute, gentlemen. I wish I had a handy picture for you, but for 6 years running, I would grow a full door knocker beard to play Charles Dickens every year.
Oh,
because my wife and I started our theater company with an adaptation. I did a 3-person adaptation of A Christmas Carol, and I played with Dickens. The conceit was that you were there to see Dickens read The Christmas Carol, so I would come out in full garb and I did not trust spirit gum back then, so I would actually grow the full beard. I would start in around June, so it would get, that was the growing season, so that it would get to full door knocker length. And it took me a long time to look like Dickens, but I would put my hair back to do the high hairline and put the hair out and then get that football shape that he did to his hair after a while. And so I do have some fabulous pictures of me with that. I don't need it because, like I said, there are some wonderful illustrations of me with that beard. So
We got one.
there it is. There it is. Well, that's a fake one, guys. Now go to this. You see the one, the top pictures, the one to the left. Yeah, that's real. That one's real. That's real. That's a real beard right there. That's me as Dickens right there.
That's
And,
great. Craig's beard's 5 o'clock shadow.
So,
Yeah.
Mark, what's going on with your largely literary theater?
Well, we just did our Twilight Zone show a couple times, and we're going to be doing that a couple more times. We've got a bunch of Poe dates coming up in October, and as we get into fall, we do an Edgar Allan Poe selection of stories and poems. In fact, we do the Cask of Amontillado. That's one of my favorite because it is so wonderfully dramatic to do that. I do the Raven and Annabelle Lee, and so we'll be doing more of that. A lot of our shows fall on what I call the spooky side of the street. We do a show called Shades of Blue and Gray, Ghosts of the Civil War. We do a show, Monsters Are Universal, which are about the origins of horror movies and their literary origins and great works of literature. And we do a show based on my Twilight Zone book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. And we do Poe, so that keeps us very busy.
I think we could always reach out to Harvey, just get one of those. His mustache, I'm pretty sure is fake. Steve Harvey. I'm pretty sure. I see that thing's just way too perfect and way too a thing. I'm pretty sure that's in wardrobe. They're gluing that on his face. So we could try to sneak one of those out of Hollywood for Mark.
That'd be great.
But I just think if we got a solid black mustache on him, he'd look like Groucho Marx over there. He'd have to end up.
Wait a minute.
He'd have to get a cigar.
For 5 years, I played Groucho. You're absolutely right. That's what. But I used to do the paint on. It wasn't the real. I grew the mustache when I was about 25. But I performed as Groucho for many years, and that's what I would get before everything kind of went white, and it went more like Mark Twain, and the makeup process for Mark Twain got a lot shorter the older I got. But my hair was jet black, and I'm looking here to see if I might. Let's see.
Yeah, my son's helping with the natural white coming in on my beard, so it's not going to be too long.
I don't know if this is going to read or not, but this is me in my early 20s. Yep,
I can see it.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And it took very little make. All that took was basically just drawing on the mustache.
Room service, set up another room.
So
the word of the day is chicken.
Yeah. We'll get Mark a beard.
Yeah.
I'll get him something from Hims.
I got a beard. I got it sitting right here in my makeup box. I can put one on with spirit.
I'll tell you, I had one of those just like that large southern, the beard going down. And I just couldn't help but saying hunk if you're like Doolin. I'm going to declare Doolin is where it's at.
What about a custard mustache?
The custard mustache.
Because every once in a while, the call for Dickens is all but evaporated over the last 10 years. But because I still do get a call from Dickens to play Dickens every occasionally, I still have this around. It applies very, very easily.
Love your chicken.
It actually has to be lightened a little bit now because when I first started doing the color of my hair was darker. As you can tell, the color of the beard does not match the color of my mustache now.
No, that's cool.
You have to do makeup, but I've got many beards here.
That's the fun part.
Yeah, we are. That's always been kind of like the running thing. It's like he'll eventually get there one day where he's going to surprise us, and it's like we'll get a picture, and it's like he'll have the mustache.
But the good part is there are certain individuals in our chat room that really like the salt and pepper look, and I've actually seen plenty of videos that a lot of the ladies like the salt and pepper look.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got no choice in the matter, Yeah,
I definitely got that. It's starting to go. It's starting to really get some patches here where it's really starting to go white. Looks like I was drinking white paint.
Gray. That's what you have when you have daughters. That's what happens. It just goes gray.
You see, everything flipped in my life from that standpoint. Is that when I first started playing Mark Twain when I was 22 years old, and it took me 2 hours to look like I look now. I mean, I basically would spend that long in the make. It was the whole Lon Chaney thing with the, drawing in the lines, doing the coloring, doing the, everything had to be sprayed in. The mustache was fake back then. It took me 2 hours to get to convincingly look like Mark Twain at 22. I could do Groucho in 2 seconds. Now it doesn't take a lot. It's basically put on the white suit, grab the cigar, and go. Now, so it's
Do you sing Lydia the Tattooed Lady?
I haven't for a long time, but I did. I used to. She was the most glorious creature under the sun. Oh Lydia, say, have you met Lydia? Oh Lydia the Tattooed Lady. I remember it.
That's cool.
Yeah, Johnny and Helen, played that one night on their radio show, and I was like, that's like one of the nice things about their old time radio show, or Radio Once More, is they do a great job of opening up the window onto that was it 1930s time period when so much of what was going on with like the Shadow radio series and the Harpo and Groucho Marx is how much all that influenced us, what we do today with these late night talk show programs.
Yeah, I think the difference is, and someone's mentioned it, is that I despair the fact that comedy has become so limited. It's comedy has sort of been reduced to one person standing at a microphone, and this sort of happened with the comedy club. I mean, we don't have comedy teams anymore. The comedy team is an American invention. It's as American as the musical. And we had kind of invented it. The idea that two performers pledged their professional troth together. And, we came up with the great artists. We came up with the Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers and Abbott and Costello and the Three Stooges and all of that wonderful stuff. And we always had great comedy teams all the way until, the last great gasp was really the Smothers Brothers and Rowan Martin. And we had some comedy teams after that, but they weren't really dominant. And then they phased out, and we don't have them anymore.
Probably the closest thing we have currently is Penn and Teller.
Yeah, and
would really be.
I mean, when we do have we've always had Stiller and Mirror. We had specialty acts. Cheech and Chong kept going for a while. We've had comedy teams, but kind of as a dominant entertainment form, like we did, where Martin and Lewis was one of the great stars, not just comedy stars, but stars, period, of the 1950s. We don't have that with comedy teams. And, and we used to have a lot of comedians who specialized in different types of comedy. And, I think a lot of comedy has become very smug and ironic. And you see a lot of people whose whole stance is being very sardonic and very, and it's like, well, that's fine when you're David Letterman and you've reached a certain point where you kind of earned that. But really, if you're 20 years old and you're already at that point, where are you going to go? Where in the world are you going to go? It's sort of like what you were talking before about not having the experience to fully grok something, to fully, it's you're kind of aping something when you do that instead of it being a true stance.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, that's it. But it saddens me. I taught 2 classes a semester for 10 years at each semester at Kent State University. So, so for 10 years, I had a very good window into what was and what wasn't staying current. And what I realized almost right from the beginning was they did not know who the Marx Brothers were, let alone ever have seen a Marx Brothers movie or why they were important. you might as well have been talking about leaders of the Russian Revolution to them. They had no notion of who you were talking about when you talked about the Marx Brothers or W.C. Fields. And that's I'm not one to sort of lament the kids today type of thing, but it does sadden me because things like the Marx Brothers were a rite of passage. We all got, there was a point where you got the Marx Brothers when you were like a young teen or preteen, right around there, and you sort of bought into the whole anti-establishment view of things. And generation after generation got the Marx Brothers. Generation after generation got Humphrey Bogart. Generation after generation got these things as sort of like we passed it along. And then at some point we just stopped passing a lot of that stuff along. And they don't know who Buster Keaton is. They don't know who W.C. Fields is. They don't know who Abbott and Costello are.
The guy in the red next to you doesn't. I know that.
Yes.
Well, one of the bigger problems we have is that they say we have a microwave generations, and if it's not done in 30 seconds or less, they just lose their interest.
That's true. Comedy, it looks a lot. The comedy of that era looks very slow to people today.
Right.
If you've grown up with something with the editing is you almost have been programmed for it to happen much more quickly. I think there's that. But the other thing is, look, we were given it. We grew up with that stuff because of a generation we were actually handed given it to us. When I was growing up in New York in the 1960s, there was no Nickelodeon. There was no Disney Channel.
No.
There was no entertainment specifically designed for kids. So they gave us Laurel and Hardy and Abbott and Costello. They gave us the stuff of our parents and our grandparents to watch as kids' entertainment.
I mean, yeah, I grew up in New York as well, and part of it is we didn't have remote control, so you kind of didn't want to get up to turn the channel. But they would also, like Channel 9 here and 11, especially on Sundays, would just run Abbott and Costello and all these great old-time black and white things that were hysterical. Plus, we grew up on cartoons that were amazing. I mean, Bugs Bunny, the Looney Tunes. The problem we have now is we have the safe generation, the safe space. People have to learn to just let go a bit and not need the safe space and not need, a label on something to warn you. Just enjoy it as it was supposed to be delivered to you. Enjoy it. Enjoy the surprise. Enjoy the, and you'll be like, oh my God, where has this been?
We grew up with something else, which was very subversive, and it seems so banal today. But when we only had 3 channels, we saw a lot more. We shared a lot more culturally. You could take something like the Ed Sullivan Show, which looks like the most traditional, the most conservative type of show there was. And yet on any given night, Sunday night on the Ed Sullivan Show, you saw ballet, opera, jazz, rhythm and blues, old comedians, new rock performers, anything and everything. How many people discovered jazz because they saw Art Tatum or on the Ed Sullivan Show? How many people turned on to rhythm and blues because they saw Ray Charles on it? The variety show brought everybody together under one roof, and we all swapped. And I didn't mean, okay, you watched the Ed Sullivan Show and you all of a sudden became a rhythm and blues fan, but you got a shot at it. Where do you get a shot at other people's cultures today? You don't. You don't. You all go to your own prescribed corner of the room and you just watch that. That's an enormous disadvantage. So I'm not criticizing when I say, these kids, they don't know these things. I'm not criticizing them. I'm saying, they've been denied certain things that we had and we took for granted. And one of them was this kind of swapping of cultures and musical tastes. And you got to sample it all. I guarantee you, if you grew up in the 1960s or in the 70s watching television, you saw a lot more of other people's cultures than you see now.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, like this one Harlan was talking about.
Yeah.
The Ed Sullivan Show as well as Lawrence Welk. I could not get out of the room fast enough when Lawrence Welk was
Lawrence
on. My
Welk
parents
killed me. My grandfather.
Oh my God, my parents would watch that, and I'm like, I'm out.
Yeah, but you know what? And this is something, and when I first got introduced to this podcast, Three Beards, with Craig, Chris, and Austin, and they interview me, I don't have enough time in the day to watch specific podcasts. There's like thousands of them. But what I loved about the show was it was real, it was informative, it was entertaining. Yes, it can be serious at times. And it reminded me of what entertainment and education and information should be. And that's why I loved it. And I'm still thankful for these guys asking me to come on. But, you know, I love the we can have fun, talk serious, and still have fun and be professional. And it's something that's not done in most shows anymore.
No.
Even the new stuff that's come out, everybody has a show, everybody has a podcast, everybody has this and that. What these guys have put together, and it took you guys a while, starting from like, hey, let's talk about sports. You know, I think it'll be one of a million podcasts like that. But you've developed over time, and it's become a wonderful place for people to learn about your work, Mark. You know, the literature, and Mark Eddy. I can't thank you enough for introducing me to other. You know, he brings in so much stuff for these guys.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's variety, yes, and it's kind of like the Three Beards Variety Hour, sponsored by Par Mall. You know,
yeah.
And I'll give you the perfect quote to go out on, because this goes back to Edgar Allan Poe. Vincent Price once said that the person who limits his interest limits his life. Now, he was not
It's an awesome quote.
He was not talking about Edgar Allan Poe when he said that. But what a great definition of Poe. Poe was interested in everything, and that's basically what he said. That's the way you should live your life. You should be, you should be ready at any second. And Price was like that. Everybody thinks of Price as a horror guy, but he was interested in art and food and everything. I mean, everything that came around. And as he said, that's what made Poe a good horror writer, is because he was interested in everything. If all you're interested in horror, you're going to be a lousy horror writer. If the only thing you're interested in is the scare, is the only thing you're interested in is the fear, you're not going to be very good. You have to come at it like any writer comes at it, with an open mind and a wide worldview, and then the horror makes sense to you. Then you can put it into perspective. You can't do that if you're this close to it, if your nose is right up against it. And a lot of our culture, that's what we do with our kids, is we take them and we put their nose right up against and say, this is what you should be watching. These are the games you should be playing. This is what this is the music you should be listening to. And so they don't discover all this other stuff. I mean, there's still some stuff which jumps generation to generation. Thank goodness. Everybody gets the Wizard of Oz sooner or later. Everybody goes down the yellow brick road.
Then you get the freaky return to Oz.
Yeah. Well, but there's some things which just you got that I think that kids still get. There's still some shared language there. Thank goodness. Everybody gets the Beatles. Doesn't mean you're a Beatles fan. Doesn't mean you'll remain a Beatles fan. But you're not gonna know who they are, and you're gonna hear some of their songs. Everybody gets Elvis. We can still use Elvis to sell things in commercials. We can still use Elvis to sell insurance and other things. He's still instantly recognizable that way. Everybody gets Star Wars. Everybody gets E.T. There's still some stuff out there that, thankfully, still does go musically and movie wise. TV, not so much. TV, that's a very transient thing, and there's not that much that's a shared thing.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought up Star Wars, because I actually had this on a picture, and I was trying to figure out if it was going to be something I was ever going to be able to share. But it's Edgar Allan Poe Damien, from. Yeah, because that's the fighter pilot. It's Poe Damien.
So would that be the Millennium Raven?
Yeah, that's what it would have. Yeah, it'd have to be. But yeah, just Poe Dameron. Yeah, I said, but it's Edgar Allan Poe Dameron. So yeah, so I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah, so everybody, like I said, once again, I'm going to put up the book here so that way everybody go to there. But you can also, I'll figure out how would you prefer people to reach out to you if they want a signed copy? I mean, I don't want to just give go publicly and just put your home address because
No, and Facebook's a wonder. You can always message me on Facebook, and I always respond. I'm very easily found. You could send. I also have a website, which is an author's website, which is markdewitziak.com. It's really strange, hard to figure it out, but it's just myname.com, and there is a email option. You can send me an email through there too. So either way is a good way to get to me.
And that's right. I said, there's a book again. I said, it's excellent book.
Thank you.
I said,
Thank
so
you.
I said, I definitely recommend, people picking that one up and reaching out to him and getting a signed copy.
No,
because he gets a couple more bucks that way too.
Yeah.
By him coming directly from him.
A little bit more than Edgar got, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So
yeah, so it's one of those, but definitely, I just appreciate you coming on. Again, Mark,
I appreciate you putting a spotlight on the book. This is putting a spotlight on Mr. Poe and the book.
Hey, the bottom square over there by your book. He was the one. He was on top of it. He kept saying, "It's like, hey, Mark's got a new book coming out. Mark's got a new book coming out. Let him. We got to get him on the show. It's going to be amazing." So he was definitely champion, and so I said he was definitely pushing. So I was more than happy to get you on. I was just glad we were able to finally figure out a time to get you here.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for it all comes down to I'll be the first to tell you that I've been a lucky guy. I've been able to do something which a lot of people won't be able to do in the coming decades, and that is make a living by putting nouns and verbs together. That's all I ever wanted to do, and it was much better than that. So I was very fortunate to be able to find a job that was writing and would support, a full lifestyle. And I think in that sense, a lot of writers are going to go back to the Poe's time. We're going to go back to the 19th century, and writing is going to become like acting, that you're still going to do it, but you're going to have a day job of some kind to support it.
Yeah.
You're going to have to, I hate it, but we had this like golden era, which was the 20th century, and we didn't know it was a golden era where you could make a living writing. And there'll be some people like Stephen King, who will be the Charles Dickens of their era, who can make a fabulous amount of money off of writing. But I think there's going to be fewer and fewer people who can do it day in, day out and just have a living wage. So that's one place where, I'll tell you, that's where I've been most fortunate, has been able to do that. So
we'll pick up a book.
Yep.
Let's
Thanks
get
again for being on. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it. And I'm going to make up for what I forgot to do in the beginning of the show. Sponsor, Hurt Radio. I thought about when we were like 15, 20 minutes in there. I'm like, I forgot it.
Chris one of those stickers to put right over his left shoulder, I think it is, brother.
He should have I gave him a sticker.
Put it on the damn wall. Sponsored by.
Muted.
Oh, I'll sign for him.
You got to unmute that if you want anybody to hear what you're saying.
It's on the back of my car, so all the probably random subscribers he gets is probably from me, from around Central Florida.
There you go.
So he's got it there, but yeah, definitely. I said proud sponsor of the Three Beards podcast, even though we are lousy at promoting every now and then on an episode, and I apologize for that. But you go to Mixler.com and set up an account there and like Ert Radio, and then guess what? You get to listen to this show again. Forget to promote him, and then Into the Outer Realms, Dimensions of the Supernatural. Maureen, she's got a couple of shows there, but Ron's also got several music lineups that he does as well as his show. So you can go there and listen to that, and then Brian, he says he's going to bring you a sticker.
I'm going to be meeting Ron in Gettysburg for the Battlefield Bash, and you're welcome. I didn't curse this episode, so less editing. So far I don't think he has to edit us too much. So yeah, you never. All
right, well, Nori Poe approves of this show. All right, so we'll have to figure out some way to promote that one. So for anybody that doesn't know what we're talking about,
there he is.
My George Noe is Edgar Allan Poe. Yeah, but everybody, thanks again for watching. Like I said, Mark, appreciate it. Best of luck with that book. I really hope you do, and just feedback. I mean, if you ever just think about it, just let us know if you've seen any, success, like people have picked up the book. I would love to hear about it.
It's been doing well. It's gone into its third printing already. So we already know.
There you go.
Successful. So yeah, it came out of the chute pretty hot. So we're
good.
The reviews have been wonderful. I cannot. Just getting your book reviewed these days is tough. But there's been about 25 national reviews on it, and they've all been very good. So. Yeah, and I'm not used to that, boy. Believe me, that's this is not a typical thing for me. It's usually things are much slower build. So I'm, I couldn't be happier with the early returns on this book.
Awesome. All right, everybody.
Good night.
Yeah, we're rebroadcast, like I said, Wednesday nights at 11 p.m. on aforementioned ERT radio. And like I said, so just check that again. It's like, thanks for everybody that's subscribers. And it's like, even if you can't throw bucks our way, share it to your timeline, bring a friend, just tell somebody about it. It's like, I've got 3 guys that are going to be, they're going to be entertaining. Come check them out. They got great guests. Just spread the word. That'll help us out. Go support Sir Brian Bowden in his 1001 podcasts.
Yeah.
With his guitar shirt, his very colorful, Technicolor coat that he's got there. Yes, the guitar shirt. It almost has a Big Lebowski type thing, like it's a bowling shirt, like that's his bowling team.
Man behind. Yeah, no.
Yeah, so go check him out. Like, support them. Mark Eddy, of course, he is the powerhouse behind Nightlight. And just to keep him from burning too brightly, Barbara has to, keep throwing water on him to cool him off, because he'll get all fired up too.
Yeah,
so.
We also had a show that went against community standards. So that's so we're bouncing back with a better program.
Put it on Rumble.
Yeah, she didn't put enough water on him too fast. He burned too brightly, and attracted the Zuckerbergs.
Yeah, seriously.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks again for watching. Appreciate it. We will
Thank you.
see everybody next week for another show, another crazy endeavor. And I said, but I want to say it might be the Golden Corralios.
Ooh, that'd be nice.
Yeah, I think that might be the one.
Way.
Yeah, I think that's the one. I think we're going to be talking about ancient civilizations.
That'd be great. That's just before my birthday.
Yeah, so I think
after my birthday. Yeah, after.
I think that's it. So, all right. Well, everybody, thanks for watching. We will see you on the next one. Good night.
Thank you, gentlemen.
You're welcome.
Care.